Europe is preparing for a potential war with Russia. That much is clear from actions like NATO recommending that all of its members increase their defense spending to 5% of their gross domestic products or GDPs by 2035. Across the continent, leaders are sending signals to Vladimir Putin that they're getting ready for a fight, and they'll be ready if and when Russia decides to start one. But there's something that these European nations don't seem to realize, and you may not have either. Russia is already at war with Europe. You just didn't notice until now. But all of the signs are there that Russia has been fighting without Europe knowing about it. That's according to George Barros, who is an analyst with the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW. On November 13th, Lithuania's LRT news outlet spoke to Barros to discuss his opinions about what Russia is doing right now and to untangle a strange phrase that Barros has been using for a while, Phase Zero. Just what is Phase Zero? If Barros is to be believed, it's the first phase in a war that Russia has already started with Europe. LRT points to several examples of what happens during this phase, including the drone incursions into European nations and even contraband balloons that are being sent into Lithuanian airspace to disrupt the country's airports. When asked if these types of incidents constitute Phase Zero, Barros answers absolutely, before he launches into an explanation of what Phase Zero really means. So in military doctrine, including Russian and Soviet military doctrine, before you actually begin a war, there is a preparation of the battlefield that occurs, well ahead of the actual shooting, Barros tells LRT. And that is Phase Zero, the informational, political, and psychological condition setting for the preparation of a larger war that Russia might wage against Europe and NATO. In other words, Phase Zero is all about Russia laying the foundations for a full-scale war that is yet to start. Attempted intimidation is a huge part of this phase, which is where the previously mentioned aerial incursions come into play. We'll dig into those incursions and the other signs that Phase Zero is underway later in the video. For now, it's enough to know that these drone incursions are designed both to test the response of the countries that Russia believes it may soon be fighting, and to let those countries know that Russia is watching, waiting, and preparing assets that can reach them whenever Putin and his cronies choose. Barros reveals that Russia has plenty of reasons why it started Phase Zero. Many of them revolve around the Baltic states of Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. I often have to make the argument that Russia has geopolitical and territorial ambitions on the Baltic states, which it defines as part of the historical Russian land, the Russian Empire, the Ruski Mir, all of these things, Barros says when talking about his discussions with Western colleagues. And the Russians also seek to completely renegotiate the security architecture for Europe. Does this mean that Putin has fully committed Russia to a full-blown war with Europe and specifically the continent's NATO members? Not necessarily, Barros says. But that commitment isn't the point of Phase Zero. Russia is laying the groundwork for what might be instead of what is already determined. Putin wants to be ready for anything, which includes having the ability to strike first and hardest at what he perceives to be Europe's weaknesses should a kinetic war break out. If nothing else, the Baltic states all seem to agree that Putin has them in his crosshairs. Back in May 2023, LRT published a report claiming to have exposed the contents of secret Kremlin documents that detail what Russia has planned for the Baltic states. Though those plans don't necessarily cover any full-blown invasions, they do discuss how Russia is attempting to influence the actions and public opinions within the trio of countries. Those documents were specially prepared for the Kremlin by Russia's Directorate for International Relations and Cultural Contacts with Foreign Countries during the fall of 2021, and they're divided into two parts. The first part describes the threats to Russian interests that the Directorate identified, with the second discussing the actions that Russia should take to overcome those threats. Those actions range from the political to the social to the military, but they all boil down to Russia wanting to strengthen its influence and ultimately control the Baltic states that were once part of the Soviet bloc. Again, it's Phase Zero as Barros describes it. And all three Baltic nations are very aware of Putin's ambitions. In March, the BBC Europe editor Katja Adler published an article in which she highlighted how all of the Baltic states are attempting to Putin-proof themselves as much as possible. She notes that Russia has been pulling many of the tricks that would fall under Barros's definition of Phase Zero, especially near Estonia. That country has recorded Russia's use of thermal imaging buoys in the Narva River that essentially act as a border between Russia and Estonia. Constant GPS jamming is in effect on that border, and it's all being done as part of a concerted Russian campaign to intimidate and psychologically toy with a much smaller country. Estonia has responded in several ways, Adler writes, including joining Lithuania and Poland in requesting its withdrawal from the International Anti-Personnel Landmine Treaty. The implication here is clear: the Baltic states and Poland are concerned about their borders, and they want to be able to use these types of landmines to protect themselves if Russia launches a ground invasion. The examples we've highlighted so far seem isolated. Really, they're anything but. The Baltic states are very aware of what Russia is doing, though the rest of Europe is either asleep at the wheel or is dragging its collective feet when it comes to formulating appropriate responses to Russia's Phase Zero. Remember that point. We'll come back to it toward the end of the video. Barros says that Russia's Phase Zero campaign will be an officially named operation, and that it's an operation that is very much underway. It's highly organized, and these activities simply did not start manifesting themselves accidentally. Somebody in the Kremlin or in the Russian General Staff gave an order. They are to begin conducting a series of events, a reconnaissance, provocations, experimenting with how to do airport closures across multiple different countries, reconnoitering military sites, Barros tells LRT. All of these Phase Zero actions are in service of Phase 1 of Russia's plan, the kinetic phase. The phase where the shooting starts and the tanks begin rolling in, assuming Russia has any left after its war with Ukraine. At least that's a possible version of Phase 1. The other version might see Russia making official demands of Europe or NATO to do or stop doing something, Barros says. Halting NATO expansion could be one of those demands, for example. If the demand is met, Russia may roll back to Phase Zero or end the phases altogether. If the demands aren't met, that's when the kinetic war for which Russia has spent years preparing starts. That kinetic war may not have started yet, but that doesn't mean that Russia isn't at war with Europe, and there are plenty of signs that point to this fact. The most obvious sign is staring Europe right in the face. Russia has told Europe that it's at war. At least it's done so in the typical Russian way, which is to act like Russia is some sort of innocent angel of a country that's only responding to aggression from others with all of the tricks that it's currently pulling. But if you weed through the lies and attempts at disinformation, Russia is pretty clearly telling all of the European countries that oppose what Putin is doing in Ukraine that those countries are in a fight. Take the comments that Putin's chief mouthpiece Dmitry Peskov made during a September 15th briefing to Russian journalists as an example. They were filled with the purposeful misspeak through which Russia blames others for what it is doing itself. NATO is at war with Russia. This is obvious and needs no proof, the Kyiv Independent reports Peskov as saying. NATO provides direct and indirect support to the Kyiv regime. As is so often the case with Russian statements like these, there is a kernel of truth to be found. NATO nations are indeed supporting Ukraine. What Peskov purposefully fails to mention is that this support is only being offered because Russia illegally invaded the country. Barros mentioned that psychological ploys are part of Phase 1, and this particular trick is aimed as much at the Russian people as it is at Europe. Peskov is telling everyday Russians that NATO is fighting against Russia, which in turn prepares those civilians for a potential future where they'll be called upon to fight a war against NATO in Europe. The powers that be in the Kremlin aren't above using their wartime tactics against their own people, and it's propaganda like this that is one of Putin's greatest tools. Since Peskov's comments, Russia has escalated its accusations against NATO's European members. On October 8th, France 24 reported that Russia is now accusing Poland, the UK, and the European Union or EU of conducting false flag operations that are supposedly framing Russia for acts of sabotage that are instead being conducted by the very countries that are being victimized. One of these operations, the outlet says, supposedly involved the UK recruiting Ukrainian agents to stage a naval attack that would have seemed like it was conducted by Russia. Bear in mind, these Ukrainian agents would have had to be pulled out of a war in which Ukraine needs everybody who's willing to fight. Still, the false flag operation was also meant to include the use of Chinese equipment, implicating Beijing in the plan. The Ukrainian operatives were to be arrested by Western agents and then claim they were acting under orders from Russia. It's all nonsense, of course, and these kinds of statements have been roundly refuted by Western officials. But again, we see Russia's Phase Zero wartime mindset come into play. Russia would have conducted the very operation that it's claiming as a false flag, but it's using that operation to potentially sow seeds of discord within Europe. Putin wants Europe's NATO members to start doubting one another, which could, in turn, make it harder for those allies to work together when the time for Phase 1 comes. So Russia is indirectly telling Europe that it's at war, and it's using these types of psychological tricks that are pulled right out of the Phase Zero playbook, as Barros describes it. But it's not just mind games that show us Russia is at war with Europe. There's plenty of physical evidence too. We've already touched on some of the aerial incursions that Russia has made into European territory in recent months, with Barros having said that these types of incursions are absolutely a sign that Russia has entered Phase Zero of its war with Europe. However, the isolated examples already noted barely scratch the surface of what Russia has been doing in Europe recently. Belgium seems to be Russia's latest target. On November 11th, the Telegraph reported that the last 2 weeks have seen mysterious drones start appearing in the skies above Belgian airports, military bases, and even nuclear plants. Security fears are rising because there's no reason why those drones would be in those locations unless somebody is trying to intimidate or perhaps learn about some of Belgium's most secure facilities. 5 drones were spotted over Belgium's Doel nuclear power plant on November 9th alone, and France, Germany and the UK have all committed to sending its counter-drone units to help with the problem. This is just the latest example of a concerted aerial campaign that began in earnest in early September when Russia sent 21 drones into Polish airspace, forcing Poland to scramble its fighter jets. Estonia, which we've already noted is dealing with strange buoys and GPS jamming, had to handle a trio of Russian MiG-31s entering its airspace a few days after the Polish incursion. Those jets stuck around for 12 minutes and refused to speak to anybody who tried to communicate with them. Psychological tricks by Russia again, perhaps, but also a showcase of Russian military might, at least from Putin's perspective, that slots right into Phase Zero. The incursions keep on coming. As the Telegraph reports, Sweden uncoincidentally started reporting on the presence of mysterious drones ahead of making its decision to sell 150 Gripen fighter jets to Ukraine. In Denmark, Russia appears to have spent much of October using drones to disrupt airports and shut down infrastructure. Norway has also been dealing with drone disruption targeting its airports. Germany's military installations have also become targets for drones, along with several of the country's airports. On and on it goes. There are literally dozens of incidents like these being reported all across Europe, and only one country that has any real motivation to cause such disruption on a massive scale. We see the psychological setting of the stage that Barros discusses as being part of Phase Zero here, along with the informational warfare that Russia likes to wage. After all, Russia isn't claiming responsibility for all of these drone sightings. Even the Telegraph article notes that there is no conclusive evidence that confirms Russia is behind the incidents. Putin is playing Europe by waging a war that many on the continent can barely even agree is being waged. This is hybrid warfare. A few steps behind the type of full-blown kinetic warfare that happens during Phase 1, but perfectly in keeping with Phase 0. Some Western analysts who have had direct dealings with Russia understand what's going on. George Robertson, who is the former Secretary General of NATO, is one of them. Robertson led the alliance between 1999 and 2003, which is when Putin first rose to power in Russia. And in speaking to Channel 4 in the UK, Robertson leaves no doubt as to where he stands on what Russia is doing in Europe right now. Russia is clearly at war with us. I have no doubt at all, even though we're not at war with them. They've clearly declared war on us, Robertson tells Channel 4 bluntly, after expressing regret that he may have trusted Putin too much when he helmed NATO. It's only by stepping back and looking at the patterns that you start to see what Russia is really doing. Peter Pomerantsov of Johns Hopkins University tells Channel 4, and when you see the large pattern, you see that all these little events, in and of themselves might seem quite minor, are actually part of a larger strategy that fits in with Russia's foreign policy aims. Those aims are to wage Phase Zero war across Europe in preparation for something much bigger that might or might not come later. There's even more evidence. Ever since the West started sanctioning Russian oil in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine, Putin has been building a shadow fleet of old tankers to transport Russian oil internationally away from the watchful gaze of the authorities. Estimates vary as to how many ships are in the fleet, which isn't surprising given its clandestine nature. However, the EU had identified 444 shadow fleet vessels by the summer of 2025, according to the Center for European Policy Analysis. Russia's leader has also spent more than $10 billion on building that fleet, Brookings claimed back in February, all of which gives us a sense of the scale of Putin's shady fleet of ships. A lot of attention is paid to how that fleet is helping Russia to circumvent sanctions, and rightfully so. That is the shadow fleet's main function. However, it should come as no surprise that there are already suggestions that Putin is using the fleet to launch Phase Zero attacks in Europe. No less than Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said as much in October, per The Guardian. Currently, Russians are using the tankers not only to earn money for the war, but also for reconnaissance and even sabotage activities, Zelensky claimed. For some, including Ukraine's president, the evidence that Russia is at war with Europe is staring the continent right in the face, and Zelensky has been quick to argue that Phase 1, or the big and very real kinetic war, may be coming sooner than Europe anticipates. On November 13th, The Independent reported Ukraine's president as saying, "We think that if we push hard, the Russians will need a pause," Zelensky said of Ukraine's battle against Russia. "But we have to recognize that they want a big war. They are preparing to be able to start such a big war in 2029 or 2030, in this period on the European continent." If Barros is right about Russia and Phase Zero, Zelensky seems to know something that most of Europe either doesn't know or is unwilling to accept. The war between Russia and Europe has already started, and it has the potential to get much worse if nothing is done about Phase Zero of that war. Earlier we asked you to remember our point about Europe seeming to be asleep at the wheel when it comes to what Russia is doing. So is Europe doing much of anything to take the war that Russia has already started back to Putin? There have been a lot of statements but no real action. And though Europe's NATO members have committed to increasing their defense spending to 5% of their GDPs, they have about a decade to hit that figure per NATO's guidelines. Europe being so slow to respond to the fight that it doesn't realize it's in means that Russia has the advantage. In October, the National Security Journal published a report claiming that Europe isn't ready for a long war with Russia, certainly not on the scale of the war currently going on in Ukraine. It says that Norway's Minister of Finance and NATO's former Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg made that claim when accepting the Knight of Freedom Award in Poland. He urged Europe to create a credible collective defense against the Russian threat, adding that current relationships within the continent and in NATO are too fragmented to allow Europe to raise that defense. As for Barros, he has his own frustrations with how European nations are dealing with what he sees as the very real fact that Russia is at war with Europe. And he has some advice for NATO's European members. Number one, we need to start calling a spade a spade. We need to start calling out Russian acts of war against NATO member states as exactly that. These are acts of war, Barros tells LRT. The ISW analyst's point is that Europe needs to get its act together and accept the position in which it now finds itself. Only when that has happened can the continent deal with Phase 0 of the Russian war plan, potentially stopping it in its tracks so that Putin can't implement Phase 1. Whether Europe will reach that realization that Barros says is needed is still up for debate. However, one thing won't change: Russia will continue committing acts of war. It's certainly doing that right now in Ukraine, and Ukraine's response has been so impressive that it's even stunned NATO. Nobody saw Ukraine's military surge coming, but now that it's here, NATO and its European members should be doing everything they can to sustain it. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of Russia's intensifying Phase 0 war against Europe. And thank you for watching.